It began with a little girl who vanished into thin air. Her name was Caylee Anthony, just 2 years old, with bright brown eyes and a smile that lit up every room she entered. On July 15, 2008, her grandmother picked up the phone and made a call that would change American television, newspapers, and living rooms forever. "My granddaughter is missing. It's been 31 days. 31 days. A month without a child." The words echoed like an alarm, piercing through the suburbs of Orlando, Florida. And the shock only deepened when suspicion didn't fall on a stranger, but on Caylee's own mother, Caylee Anthony. Caylee Anthony, a young woman just 22 years old, suddenly became the center of a media firestorm. Once just another face in the Florida sun, she was now painted as the villain of every parent's nightmare. Headlines branded her the most hated mom in America. Why? Because while her daughter was missing, Caylee seemed to be living a double life. Dancing in nightclubs, getting a tattoo that read Bella Vita, which means beautiful life. The contrast between the missing child and the smiling mother was so stark, so unsettling, that America stopped in its tracks. This was no ordinary missing child case. It was the beginning of a trial that would shock the entire nation and raise a question no one wanted to ask. Could a mother really be responsible for the death of her own daughter? Don't look away, because the truth behind this story will take you places you cannot imagine. Before she became a headline, Caylee Anthony was just another young woman in Orlando. Born in 1986, she grew up in a working-class family, living in the suburban home of her parents, George and Cindy Anthony. On the outside, theirs looked like the perfect Florida household. A father who had once been a police officer, a mother who worked as a nurse, a neat lawn, and a swimming pool in the backyard. Caylee herself was remembered by neighbors and classmates as bubbly, friendly, the kind of girl who seemed to have everything under control. Yet beneath that sunny exterior, there were whispers, stories of lies told casually, of jobs that never really existed, of school classes skipped without explanation. Even then, Caylee had a knack for hiding cracks behind a smile. In August 2005, she gave birth to a baby girl, Caylee Anthony. The identity of the child's father remains uncertain to this day, a mystery Caylee never clearly answered. Some believed it was a fleeting boyfriend, others thought it might be a longer relationship, but Caylee always deflected the question. For Cindy and George, however, Caylee was the center of their world. They stepped in as second parents, doting grandparents who provided stability where their daughter could not. To neighbors, the Anthonys looked like a close-knit family. Photos showed Caylee playing in the backyard pool, riding on her grandfather's shoulders, or sitting in her grandmother's lap with a wide smile. In those images, nothing looked amiss. This was a little girl surrounded by love, laughter, and seemingly endless care. And yet, even within that household, tension brewed. Cindy was strict, controlling at times, while Caylee resisted boundaries. Arguments flared over Caylee's responsibilities as a mother, her finances, and her honesty. George, caught in the middle, tried to keep peace but often felt powerless. Behind the white walls of that Orlando home, the image of perfection was already starting to fracture. Still, to the outside world, Caylee's life seemed idyllic. She attended birthday parties, splashed in inflatable pools, and posed for photos in adorable dresses. She was the joy of her grandparents' later years, the reason they worked long shifts and put up with family drama. In many ways, Caylee was being raised by three adults, her mother and her grandparents, though only one of them carried the title of mom. This dynamic created a silent tug-of-war. Cindy often acted as the decision-maker, while Caylee chafed under her mother's authority. Friends noticed Caylee lying about small details, claiming to have a stable job at Universal Studios, or that she had childcare arrangements when she didn't. These lies seemed harmless at first, but they pointed to a troubling pattern. The most striking detail? For months, Caylee insisted she worked at Universal Studios in Orlando. She described co-workers, shifts, and projects. It wasn't until much later that police would uncover the truth. Caylee had never worked there at all. It was a fabrication, repeated with such confidence that even close friends believed it. This ability to weave false stories into everyday life would later become central to the case. But at the time, no one could have predicted how dangerous those lies might become. For Caylee, life remained filled with playgrounds, cartoons, and bedtime stories. Yet within her family's walls, storms were gathering. Storms that only a 2-year-old could never see coming. The Anthony home looked like the American dream on the surface, but inside secrets were quietly piling up, waiting for the day they would explode. The picture of a happy family could not hide the small fractures that slowly spread beneath the surface. To outsiders, the Anthony home seemed ordinary, but those who lived inside knew it was far from perfect. Caylee Anthony often clashed with her mother, Cindy. Cindy was fiercely protective of Caylee, sometimes stepping into the role of primary caregiver. Friends noticed how Cindy would make decisions for Caylee's future. What clothes she wore, which doctor she visited, where she spent her afternoons. For Caylee, this felt suffocating. She was Caylee's mother, yet she was treated as if she was still a child herself. These tensions only grew as Caylee's pattern of dishonesty became more visible. She told friends she worked full-time at Universal Studios, yet no one ever saw a paycheck. She borrowed money, borrowed cars, borrowed time, weaving excuses into a tapestry that seemed convincing until you looked closely. Even her close friend, Amy Huizenga, would later recall how Caylee spun stories about rent, jobs, and plans that never quite lined up. In the months before Caylee disappeared, cracks widened. Caylee often stayed out late, leaving Caylee in her grandparents' care. She wanted freedom, to go dancing with friends, to live the carefree life of a young woman in her early 20s. But freedom came at a cost. Her responsibilities as a mother were slipping further from her grasp. In June 2008, Caylee had an explosive argument with Cindy. Neighbors reported shouting from the Anthony home. The dispute centered on Caylee's lies, her lack of work, and how much of Caylee's care fell on Cindy's shoulders. Words cut deep, and the rift between mother and daughter grew wider. Meanwhile, George Anthony was struggling with his own disappointments. Once a law enforcement officer, now working low-paying jobs, he felt the weight of failure. He wanted to protect Caylee, to support his wife, but he couldn't control the growing chaos. George, quiet and observant, often looked away rather than confront the mounting problems. Yet through all this turmoil, Caylee remained the bright center of the household. She was innocent, too young to notice the lies, the tension, the shouting matches. She danced in the living room, wore princess costumes, and called her grandparents Jojo and Cece. To her, life was still magical, but beneath her laughter, the household was cracking, and those cracks were about to shatter into pieces. Caylee's disappearance in July 2008 did not come out of nowhere. It was the result of years of strain, dishonesty, and unresolved conflict. Friends later wondered, could this tragedy have been prevented if someone had listened earlier? If someone had confronted the lies before they grew too large? Was this disaster inevitable? Or could a family that seemed so ordinary have been saved from collapse? The summer of 2008 in Orlando was sweltering, humid, and restless. For most families, it was a season of pool parties and vacations. But inside the Anthony household, tensions had reached their breaking point. On June 16, 2008, it would be the last day Caylee Marie Anthony was ever seen alive. The details of that day are pieced together from fragments, testimonies, phone records, and the haunting silence that followed. That morning, neighbors remembered seeing Caylee playing with her mother in the yard. Nothing seemed unusual. Yet by nightfall, something had shifted. Later that day, Caylee left the house with Caylee, telling her parents she would be away for a while. George remembered giving his granddaughter one last kiss. She was wearing a bright little outfit, smiling as always. That image would be etched into his memory forever. From that moment on, Caylee was never seen again. In the 31 days that followed, Caylee Anthony spun a story that confused everyone around her. She told her mother that Caylee was with a trusted babysitter named Zanny. She told her friends she was traveling, busy with work, juggling life as a young mom. But the truth was chilling. No one outside the Anthony home saw Caylee alive again. During that month, Caylee lived as if nothing had happened. She stayed with her boyfriend, went to nightclubs, entered a hot body contest, and posted photos that would later appear on every news channel. She even got a tattoo etched into her skin. Bella Vita, Italian for beautiful life. To the world, these images felt like daggers. While her daughter was missing, Caylee was smiling on dance floors. her arms wrapped around friends, her life seemingly untouched by tragedy. It was the contrast that made Americans furious, the innocence of a lost child against the carefree grin of her mother. On July 15, 2008, the facade finally shattered. Caylee Anthony, desperate for answers, dialed 911. Her words were frantic, almost incoherent. "There's something wrong. It smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car." Police responded immediately, and Casey's web of lies began to unravel. Investigators discovered Casey had been driving her white Pontiac Sunfire. When they opened the trunk, a foul odor filled the air. Trained officers instantly recognized it. The unmistakable smell of human decomposition. Forensic testing later confirmed traces of chloroform, and hair consistent with Caylee's was found in the trunk. And yet, Casey stuck to her story. She insisted Caylee had been kidnapped by the babysitter, Zanny. But when detectives pressed for details, the story collapsed. The babysitter didn't exist. Addresses Casey gave were false. Every lead was a dead end. The tragedy deepened 6 months later. On December 11, 2008, a meter reader named Roy Kronk stumbled upon a garbage bag in a wooded area less than half a mile from the Anthony home. Inside were skeletal remains, a tiny skull, a small jawbone with duct tape still attached. It was Caylee. The discovery sent shockwaves across the country. Millions watched as crime scene investigators carried the evidence out of the woods. Teddy bears, flowers, and handwritten notes piled up on the Anthony lawn. The little girl with the bright brown eyes had been reduced to bones in a bag. And at the center of it all stood Caylee Anthony, calm, emotionless, telling police one lie after another. By the time the trial began in 2011, it had become a spectacle unlike anything Florida had seen in decades. Crowds lined up outside the courthouse before dawn, desperate for a seat inside. News cameras broadcast every expression on Caylee Anthony's face. Commentators filled the airwaves with speculation, and strangers argued across dinner tables about guilt and innocence. The prosecutors laid out their theory with precision. They said Casey killed her daughter because she wanted freedom. Caylee was an obstacle to nights out, boyfriends, and the beautiful life tattooed on Casey's skin. The state argued that Casey used chloroform to knock Caylee unconscious, placed duct tape over her nose and mouth, and then left her body in a wooded area. They pointed to the smell of decomposition in Casey's car trunk, to computer searches for chloroform on the family computer, and to the 31 days of lies. Their argument was simple. No innocent mother behaves this way. The defense countered with a story that stunned the courtroom. They claimed Caylee drowned accidentally in the family pool on June 16, 2008. They said George Anthony discovered the child and, in panic, helped hide the death. They argued there was no proof Caylee was murdered at all. The duct tape, the searches, the smell, each detail, they insisted, could be explained without declaring Casey a killer. Day after day, the jury listened to clashing narratives. Scientists described hair and chemicals found in the trunk. Friends testified about Casey's calm behavior while Caylee was missing. Police officers recounted her lies. Yet the defense pressed the same point. There was no direct evidence. No fingerprints on the duct tape. No eyewitness. No medical examiner able to state a cause of death with certainty. Outside, the anger grew louder. Protesters held signs reading "Justice for Caylee." Television hosts demanded conviction. The phrase "baby killer" echoed through the streets each morning as Casey was brought to court. To much of the public, the trial was already decided. But inside the jury room, the law required proof beyond a reasonable doubt. On July 5, 2011, after 6 weeks of testimony and 11 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The room held its breath as the verdict was read. Not guilty of first-degree murder, not guilty of manslaughter, not guilty of aggravated child abuse. Casey was found guilty only of providing false information to the police. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Gasps filled the courtroom. Outside, crowds screamed and wept. Across the country, people shouted at their televisions. How could a mother walk free when her child had been found with duct tape across her skull? To some, it was proof that the justice system had failed. To others, it was a reminder that suspicion, no matter how strong, cannot replace evidence. Caylee Anthony left the courthouse with her life intact, but her reputation destroyed. For many Americans, the verdict changed nothing. She remained the most hated mom in America, forever tied to the image of her daughter's tiny remains pulled from the woods. When the jury's words were read, the world gasped. Some saw it as justice denied, others as the system working exactly as designed. Caylee Anthony walked free, but freedom did not bring peace. She could never escape the shadow of her daughter's face or the eyes of a public that had already judged her guilty. For Cindy and George, the loss of Caylee was a wound that never closed. The toys in the playroom, the laughter that once filled the house, all vanished into silence. They became symbols of grief, standing on their lawn beneath the gaze of cameras, holding on to photos of the little girl who would never grow up. America, too, was left divided. Some believed Caylee had committed the ultimate betrayal, killing her child for a taste of youth and pleasure. Others saw her as a young woman consumed by lies and dysfunction, perhaps guilty of negligence, but not of murder. The debate continues even now, more than a decade later, in documentaries, podcasts, and living room conversations. Caylee herself lives in the shadows. She rarely speaks, rarely appears, and when she does, the anger resurfaces. She will forever carry the name that millions gave her, the most hated mom in America. And at the center of it all remains a child who should have had her whole life ahead. Caylee's smile is frozen in photographs, her memory carried in teddy bears, in prayers and questions that will never be answered. So we are left with the same haunting choice that gripped a nation. Was Caylee Anthony a murderer, or was she another product of a broken home and a broken system? In the end, each of us must decide what we believe. If you want to understand another family tragedy that once shook America to its core, stay with us, because the next story may change the way you see everything.